When Lillian Beckford paid $14,000 for the Caraway Cottage at a county tax auction, every neighbor on that street said the same thing. She got cheated. The house had been sitting empty for 70 years. The roof had gone soft. The porch rail had rotted through. The windows were so thick with dust that from the outside, the glass looked painted. And somewhere inside, according to what little anyone still remembered, a woman named Edith Caraway had lived out the last years of her life completely alone before dying in 1955. No husband, no children, no one who came to claim anything she left behind. Lillian was 67 years old. She had taught high school history in Corinth for 34 years. She had buried her husband in 2003 and her daughter in 2005. She knew what an empty house felt like from the inside. Maybe that was why she was not afraid of this one. The key was iron and stiff in the lock. The door opened with a sound like something exhaling for the first time in decades. Lillian stepped in and stood still. Dust on the floorboards, an empty bookshelf, a wingback chair with the fabric gone gray, and 2 fireplaces. She almost walked past the second one. It was smaller, set into the north wall, built from the same fieldstone as the first. But something about it was wrong. She crouched down and looked into the firebox. No flue, no connection to any chimney above. She pressed her knuckles against the back wall and knocked. The sound that came back was hollow. She worked for 20 minutes with a pry bar before the first brick came loose, then another. Then the beam of her flashlight found something inside the wall that had no business being there. A brass box the size of a shoebox gone green with age. A line of lead solder ran all the way around the lid. Someone had sealed it to stay sealed. Lillian set it on the floor and worked the edge of a knife under the seal. The lead gave. She lifted the lid. On top, folded carefully, was a small knitted blanket. White wool gone ivory with time. The knitting needles were still in it. Whoever had been making this blanket had never finished it. Beneath the blanket were 3 pieces of paper. Birth certificates. Windsor County Hospital. The ink was black and the paper was cotton stock, and each one carried a red stamp from the attending physician, a Dr. Amos Crane. Lillian read the first one, then the second, then the third. 3 children, 3 different fathers, and above every line marked Mother the same name, written each time in the same careful hand. Edith Caraway. At the bottom of the box was a letter. The handwriting was shaky the way handwriting gets when the person holding the pen is very old or very tired or both. To whoever opens this box, I was not a recluse. I was a mother, and the 3 most respected families in this town took my children from me. Lillian sat on the floor of that empty house for a long time without moving. Edith Caraway had hidden this box inside a fake fireplace and sealed it with lead and left it there for 70 years. 3 birth certificates, 3 infants, 3 families who had built their names and their reputations on a secret that was never supposed to see daylight. And somehow, after all of that, she had trusted that the right person would eventually find it. The brass box and the wall. The town of Corinth, Vermont sits in a valley where the hills close in from 3 sides, and in early October the maples go red all at once, the way they do in New England when the first cold night arrives without warning. Lillian Beckford drove in on Route 5 just after 8 in the morning, her truck loaded with cleaning supplies, a pry bar, 2 gallons of paint she probably would not need yet, and a thermos of coffee that was already half empty. She had made the drive from Burlington the evening before, slept in a motel off the interstate, and started again at first light. She had not told anyone in Burlington where she was going. There was no one left to tell. Elm Street was the last road before the town ended. No streetlights. The maples on both sides had dropped most of their leaves onto the pavement, and the ones still clinging to the branches were the deep burgundy color that comes just before a tree lets go entirely. The Caraway house sat at the far end, set back from the road by a short gravel drive and a wooden fence that had been leaning at the same angle for what looked like several decades. Lillian pulled in and cut the engine. She sat for a moment with both hands in her lap, looking at the house through the windshield. Fieldstone foundation, clapboard siding gone gray, a covered porch with one post slightly shorter than the others which gave the whole roof line a faint tilt. 2 windows on the second floor, each one filmed with a winter's worth of dust, or several winters, or 70 winters. She had seen photographs in the county assessor's file. The house looked the same in the photographs. It had the look of something that had simply stopped. She was climbing out of the truck when she heard the voice. "You are the one who bought it." The woman standing at the fence line next door was 81 years old and dressed for a colder morning than this one, a wool coat buttoned to the collar and rubber boots that had seen a lot of seasons. Her name, Lillian would learn in the next 2 minutes, was Muriel Gaines, and she had lived in the house next door for 63 years, which meant she had been watching the Caraway place sit empty for most of her adult life. "I am," Lillian said. Muriel studied her for a moment, the way people do when they are deciding how much to say. "My mother used to bring us past this house on the long way to school, just so we would not have to walk by it. She said Edith Caraway had gone peculiar, locked herself in and did not come out." She paused. "I was 9 years old the year the woman died. I remember because my mother crossed herself when she heard, which she only did for certain kinds of news." "What kind of news was that?" Lillian asked. Muriel looked at the house. "The kind where a person dies alone and nobody finds them right away?" Lillian thanked her and picked up her thermos and her keys and walked to the front door. The key was iron and had been cut a very long time ago. It turned in the lock with the stiff resistance of something that had not moved in years. The door swung inward. A smell came out to meet her, not unpleasant, dry and papery and faintly mineral, the smell of a house that had been sealed against the weather for a very long time. Lillian stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping in. The front room was small and ran the full width of the house. A wingback chair sat facing the window that looked onto the street, its fabric gone the color of ash. An empty bookshelf against the east wall, the shelves still holding the faint rectangular outlines of books that had sat there long enough to leave their shadows in the dust. A hooked rug in the center of the floor, its pattern nearly gone. And on the south wall, a large stone fireplace, broad enough to heat the whole room with a proper flue, and a cast-iron damper and a thick oak lintel worn smooth by years of hands resting on it. Lillian set her thermos on the mantel and looked around the room slowly, the way she used to look at a new classroom at the start of a school year taking inventory. After 34 years of teaching history, she had learned that a room always tells you more than the people who lived in it intended. She was turning toward the hallway when she stopped. There was a second fireplace. It was in the north corner of the room, smaller than the first, built from the same local fieldstone, with a modest wood surround, painted white, now yellowed. She had not noticed it when she came in because her eye had gone straight to the larger one on the south wall, the way it was meant to. But now that she saw it, she stood still for a moment, looking at it, and something that had been trained into her over decades of reading old houses and old plans and old records went quietly alert. She crossed the room and crouched in front of it. The firebox was the right depth. The andirons were still in place, but there was no damper lever. She looked up into the throat and found solid stone 18 inches above the grate. No flue, no passage to any chimney above. She stood up and walked to the exterior wall on that side of the house and traced the line of where a chimney stack should have risen. Nothing. The roof line was clean. She came back to the north fireplace and stood in front of it for a long time. Someone had built a fireplace that could never hold a fire, had taken the time to cut and set the stone and frame the surround and paint it white, and fit the andirons in place, all for something that was never going to be used as a fireplace. Lillian had spent 34 years teaching her students to ask one question when something in the historical record did not make sense. If it is not what it appears to be, what is it actually for? She went to the truck and came back with the pry bar. She started at the back wall of the firebox where the mortar between the stones was thinner than it should have been, the joints a little too clean, the kind of clean that comes not from age but from being done carefully and without haste by someone who knew what they were doing and was not hurrying. She worked the flat end of the bar into the first joint and leaned on it. The first stone shifted. She worked it free and set it on the grate and shone her flashlight into the gap. Not solid wall behind it, a void, a space deliberately left. She cleared 4 more stones. The opening was wide enough now to reach an arm inside. She pushed the flashlight through first. The beam landed on a box. It sat on a narrow shelf of flat stone, the kind of shelf you would build if you intended to put something there and leave it. The box was brass, roughly the size of a shoebox, its surface gone entirely green with patina. Around the seam where the lid met the base, someone had run a careful line of lead solder, not quickly, not sloppily, but slowly and with purpose, as if whatever was inside was something that needed to be protected from the air itself. Lillian set the pry bar down and reached in with both hands. The box was heavier than she expected. Not dramatically, but noticeably, the weight of paper and metal and something else she could not name, the weight of something that had been waiting a very long time. She carried it to the center of the room and set it on the floor and knelt beside it. The lead seal was old and dry. She worked her folding knife around the seam, and the solder gave in sections a soft resistance, like the last resistance of something that had held on as long as it could. She lifted the lid. On top, folded with the careful tidiness of someone who had wanted it to stay folded, was a small knitted blanket. White wool turned ivory with time. It was unfinished. The knitting needles were still in it, still threaded through the last row of stitches, as if the person who had been making it had set it down for a moment and then simply never come back. Lillian sat with the blanket in her hands for a moment before she set it aside. Beneath it were papers. Cotton stock, the kind used for official documents in the first half of the last century, gone the pale amber of old ivory. She lifted the first sheet and held her flashlight over it and read the heading across the top. Certificate of Live Birth, Windsor County Hospital, Commonwealth of Vermont. She read the line that said Mother. She read the name written there. Then she picked up the second sheet and read it, then the third. Outside, a gust came through the maples, and a handful of leaves came loose and scraped across the porch boards, and the old house settled the way old houses do in the cold, a small sound like a breath drawn in and held. The 3 certificates were laid out on the floor in front of her by side the way she used to lay out primary sources on her classroom desk when she wanted students to read them in sequence and draw their own conclusions before she told them anything. She read the first one again slowly. Thomas, born March 12, 1948, Windsor County Hospital, Mother Edith Carraway, age 45, Father Joseph Taggart, age 24, occupation mill worker. The second, Margaret, born September 7, 1950, Mother Edith Carraway, age 47, Father Joseph Taggart. The third, John, born February 19, 1952, Mother Edith Carraway, age 49, Father Joseph Taggart. Lillian sat with that for a moment. The same 2 people, 3 times, over 4 years. The math of it was simple, and the story inside the math was not simple at all. Edith Carraway had been 44 years old when the first child was conceived. The last child of the Carraway family, the woman who had inherited the name and the house and whatever was left of the reputation after the mill closed, had spent the years between 1947 and 1952 bearing 3 children by a man 20 years younger than herself, a man who worked for her father, a man whose name appeared on each of these certificates in the same careful institutional handwriting, and then, as far as Lillian could tell, nowhere else in the public record of this town at all. No adoption filings. She already knew that much from the county records she had reviewed before the auction. If there had been formal proceedings, they would have shown up. Whatever had happened to these 3 children had happened outside the courthouse. At the bottom of the box, beneath the certificates, was a small envelope. Inside were 3 photographs, black and white, printed on the thin paper stock of the late 1940s and early 1950s, each one showing an infant. A newborn face, eyes closed or barely open, wrapped in a hospital blanket. 3 different photographs, 3 different children, each one taken in what appeared to be the same room, the same hospital window in the background. She turned the first photograph over. The handwriting on the back was not the firm hand of a younger woman. It was the careful, slightly unsteady script of someone writing with great deliberateness, the way people write when they want to be sure the words stay legible. Thomas, 3 days old, Be strong. She turned the second. Margaret, 2 days old, be gentle. The third, John, 1 day old, be brave. Lillian set the photographs down in a row above the certificates and looked at all 6 pieces of paper together and did not say anything for a while. Then she picked up the letter. It was written on personal stationery, the kind that came in boxes from the drugstore, pale blue once, and now the color of old cream. The date at the top was November 4th, 1954, 14 months before Edith Carraway died in this house alone in the winter of 1955. The handwriting was the same unsteady, careful script as the backs of the photographs, only more so the writing of a woman in her early 50s whose hands had begun to betray her, but whose intention had not. To whoever opens this box, I am Edith Carraway. My father was Harold Carraway. He owned the flour mill on the east side of town for 30 years, and he sat on the county board, and he gave money to the church, and everyone in Corinth knew his name and thought well of it. In 1947, when I was 44 years old, I was carrying a child. The father was Joseph Taggart, who worked in my father's mill. My father sent Joseph away and told him that if he came back, he would be arrested. Then my father told me what was going to happen. The child would be born. The child would be given to a family he had already chosen. A good family, he said. A family with a name. The child would have a better life than I could give it. That was what he said. I begged him to let me keep the child. He refused. He said the only alternative was to leave Corinth and never come back, and he knew I would not leave because Joseph might come back, and I needed to be here when he did. Joseph never came back. I stayed. Thomas was born in March of 1948 and was placed with the Winthrop family before he was a week old. I was not told where he was going until after he was gone. My father told me the name as if he was doing me a kindness. I did not leave Corinth. I should explain why. From the window of this room, I can see the corner of Elm Street and Main. I watched Thomas Winthrop walk to the preparatory school in his blue uniform in the fall of 1958. I watched Margaret Pemberton wear a red ribbon in her hair at the Harvest Festival in 1960. I watched John Cross ride his bicycle past the corner every afternoon in the summer of 1962. They did not know who I was. I was the peculiar woman at the end of Elm Street. I was Harold Carraway's strange daughter who never married and never left. But I knew who they were. Every day for the rest of my life I have known who they were. I was not a recluse. I was a mother who had been told that disappearing was the price of staying close. If you are reading this, I am asking you for one thing. Find them. Tell them that a woman named Edith Carraway was their mother. Tell them that she watched them grow up from this window. Tell them she wrote their names on the backs of their photographs and told each of them who to be because it was the only thing she was allowed to give them. Tell them she never stopped. Lillian read the letter twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands and looked at the window at the far end of the room. She had not cried at Frank's funeral. She had not cried at Rebecca's, which she was not sure she had ever forgiven herself for the dry, terrible numbness of that day, standing at the graveside in the November cold, unable to produce the tears that would have meant the grief was moving through her, rather than sitting in her like stone. She had cried later privately in the months and years that followed, but never in the way that felt like release. She had mostly stopped expecting release. She was crying now. Not loudly, not dramatically, the way people cry when something reaches a place that has been closed off for a long time, a quiet and almost surprised grief, the kind that arrives not as pain, but as recognition. Edith Carraway had stood at the window of this room every day for 20 years and watched 3 children grow up who did not know she was their mother. She had watched them walk to school and ride bicycles and wear ribbons at festivals, and she had not been allowed to cross the street and say their names. Lillian knew what it was to stand at a window and understand that something you loved was moving through the world without you. She knew the specific texture of that. She had stood at the window of her apartment in Burlington every morning for the first year after Rebecca died and watched the street below and understood in her body, not just her mind, that her daughter was not in the world anymore, and the world did not know or care. Edith had stood at this window and her children had been in the world. They had been right there. That was different. That was its own particular kind of unbearable. Lillian wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up slowly. She carried the letter to the window and stood where Edith had stood. Elm Street ran straight to the corner of Main, the maples on both sides nearly bare, now a few last leaves coming down in the still morning air. She stood there for a long time. Then she said quietly to the room to the window to wherever Edith Carraway was or was not, "I will find them. I promise you that." She folded the letter and set it carefully with the photographs and the certificates on the floor. Then she stood very still and thought about what she had just said. Thomas, Margaret, John. She had read enough local history in the weeks before the auction to know certain names. The Winthrops had been the county's banking family since before the First World War. Malcolm Winthrop had served as a Windsor County judge for nearly 2 decades. She had seen his photograph in the Corinth Courier archives, a formal portrait, a man in his mid-70s with a sharp face and the careful expression of someone who had spent a career being looked at. She had not known reading that photograph that she was looking at Edith Carraway's son. He did not know it either. 76 years old, a judge, a man who had built an entire life on the foundation of a name that was not the name his mother had given him in a town where his mother had watched him walk to school every morning from the window at the end of the street. Lillian looked out at Elm Street and thought about what it meant to know a thing like that, and what it meant to be the person who now had to decide what to do with it. She spent the first day at the Windsor County Historical Society on the second floor of the Corinth Public Library, a single room with long oak tables and metal shelving, and a volunteer archivist named Dorothy, who was 73 years old and had been managing the collection since 1987, and who told Lillian within the first 10 minutes that she remembered hearing the name Carraway as a child, the way you remember the name of a house where something bad happened. Lillian did not tell Dorothy what she had found. She asked for the mill records, the county court filings from 1945 through 1955, and the bound volumes of the Corinth Courier for the same period. Dorothy brought them on a cart without asking why. The mill ledgers were in 3 bound volumes, each one catalogued by year. Lillian found the payroll records for 1942 through 1947. Joseph Taggart appeared first in the summer of 1942, listed as a general laborer at the Carraway Flour Mill, age 18. His wages were recorded every 2 weeks without interruption for 5 years. The handwriting changed once in 1945 when a new bookkeeper apparently took over, but the name continued: Joseph Taggart, Joseph Taggart, Joseph Taggart. Then October 1947. The name appeared at the top of the column and then stopped. A single diagonal line had been drawn through it in a different ink, darker, applied with more pressure than the surrounding entries. No notation, no reason given. The line simply ended his employment the same way you might cross out a word you had decided not to use. Lillian wrote the date in her notebook and turned to the court records. The Windsor County adoption filings from 1948, 1950, and 1952 were listed in the index under a case number with a notation she had to ask Dorothy to help her interpret. Sealed, by order of presiding judge. Permanent. No petition for unsealing on record. She looked at the name of the presiding judge on all 3 filings. Harold R. Carraway, Justice of the Peace, Windsor County. Edith's father had signed the adoption papers for his own grandchildren. He had sat in his capacity as a judicial officer of the county and made it legal and then sealed the record so that no one could ever look inside. He had used the authority the county had given him to make the erasure permanent. Lillian sat with that for a while. Then she asked for the probate records from 1953 and found the will. Harold Carraway had written it himself in the formal language of a man who had spent time around legal documents and believed that precision was the same thing as righteousness. The mill went to the Winthrop family. The main house and the Carraway land on the north side of town went to the Pemberton family. The remaining parcels went to the Cross family. Each transfer was conditioned on a clause that ran to 3 sentences, and which Lillian read twice to be certain she had understood it correctly, The families were bound to make no public disclosure regarding the circumstances of the transfers, to make no claim of connection to the Caraway estate beyond what was stated in the will, and to ensure that the records of the 3 adoptions remained sealed in perpetuity. He had paid them with the estate. He had given them the mill and the land and the house in exchange for their silence, and he had made the silence a legal condition of the inheritance. At the bottom of the page, in the section designating what remained for Edith Harold Caraway, had written one sentence in addition to the legal description of the cottage and the $500. "My daughter has brought dishonor upon this family. This provision represents my forbearance." Lillian read the word forbearance and set the document down on the table and looked at the wall for a moment. She had taught a unit every year on the language of power, how people in positions of authority used formal language to make cruelty sound like order, how the passive voice could erase the person doing the harm while keeping the harm itself intact, how a word like forbearance could mean patience and restraint in one context and in another could mean I am choosing not to destroy you entirely, and you should be grateful. Harold Caraway had taken his daughter's children, had used his position as a county justice to seal the record, had transferred his estate to the 3 families who had taken them in exchange for silence, and then had written in his will that what he had left her, the cottage at the end of the street and $500, was an act of mercy. She found the obituary in the bound Corinth Courier from February 1955. It ran 4 sentences. Mrs. Edith Caraway, 52, died yesterday at her home on Elm Street. She was the daughter of the late Harold Caraway, founder of Caraway Flour Mill. She never married. She is survived by no children. Private funeral services will be held at the discretion of the estate. She never married. She is survived by no children. Lillian put her finger on the line and held it there. A lie printed in a newspaper and preserved in an archive and read by no one for 70 years. Edith Caraway had been survived by 3 children. They had been at the Harvest Festival the year before she died, close enough to see from the edge of the crowd. The photograph was in a folder of miscellaneous community photographs from the early 1950s, donated by an anonymous source sometime in the 1970s. Lillian found it near the bottom of the 3rd folder. She checked a 4x6 print slightly overexposed taken at the Corinth Harvest Festival in the fall of 1953. It showed the festival green, the booths, and the bunting, a crowd of perhaps 200 people in their good autumn clothes. In the foreground, several couples were talking. In the middle distance, children were gathered around a carousel. At the right edge of the photograph, slightly apart from everyone else, a woman stood alone. She wore a gray coat and held her handbag with both hands. She was not looking at the camera. Her face was turned toward the middle of the photograph. Lillian picked up the magnifying glass Dorothy kept on the table for researchers working with small print and held it over the center of the image. 3 children near the carousel, a boy of 5 or 6 in a dark jacket, a girl of 3 in a pale dress, a baby being held by a woman Lillian recognized from another photograph in the collection as Catherine Pemberton. She moved the glass back to the edge of the photograph, to the woman in the gray coat. Edith Caraway was looking at her children. She was 20 feet away. She was surrounded by 200 people who knew her name and knew her father's name, and not one of them knew what she was doing, standing at the edge of the crowd, every year, year after year, watching 3 children who did not know she existed. Lillian set the magnifying glass down carefully. She thought about what it required of a person to do that. To come to the festival every year knowing you could not cross the grass and speak to them. To stand where you could see them and know closer, to watch a woman you had never met hold your youngest child and smile at something the child did and feel whatever Edith Caraway felt watching that, and then fold it away and go home to the cottage at the end of Elm Street and sit by the window and wait for the following year. She closed the folders and stacked them neatly and sat in the quiet of the archive room for a long time. Then she took out her phone. She had written the number down 2 days ago from the county court directory. She dialed it, and it rang twice before a woman answered. Office of Judge Winthrop. How may I help you? Lillian looked at the cover of the folder in front of her at the label typed on its tab. Caraway Family Photographs, 1940s and 1950s. I need to speak with Judge Winthrop, she said. It is a personal matter. It concerns his mother. There was a pause on the line. His mother passed away some years ago, the woman said carefully. May I ask what this is regarding? Lillian thought about how to answer that. Not Mrs. Winthrop, she said. His birth mother. Her name was Edith Carraway, and I believe he will want to hear what I have to say. If you have found this story worth staying with, please subscribe. Edith Carraway watched her 3 children grow up from a window at the end of a quiet street for 20 years and was never once called their mother. In the next part, Lillian Beckford makes the call that will unravel 70 years of silence, and the people on the other end of that truth are not ready for it. She did not go directly to Malcolm Winthrop. She had made the call from the archive and given her name and said what she had said, and the secretary had gone quiet for a moment and then told her that the judge would need some time and would be in contact. 3 days later, a message came to her cell phone, brief and formal, giving a date and a time and an address she already knew. The Windsor County Courthouse. 10 in the morning. That gave her a week. She used it. The University of Vermont had a forensic documents program housed in a building on the north end of campus that smelled of chemicals and old paper in a ratio that shifted depending on which end of the corridor you were standing in. Dr. Helena Vance had run the program for 11 years, and before that had spent 8 years doing authentication work for the National Archives. Lillian had found her name in a footnote of a Vermont Historical Society paper she had read 3 years ago and had not expected to use. She called ahead and explained what she had, and Helena told her to come the following morning and bring everything. They worked for 2 days. Helena examined the certificates under magnification, first looking at the paper stock and the printing and the condition of the fibers. Then she ran the ink under a spectrometer. Then she spent the better part of an afternoon with the signature of Dr. Amos Crane, the attending physician whose name appeared on all 3 birth certificates, comparing it against a set of reference documents she had located in the hospital's archived records from the same period, 2 surgical reports and an intake form and a letter Crane had written to the County Board of Health in 1949. She sat back from the comparison screen and looked at Lillian over the top of her glasses. The paper is consistent with Windsor County Hospital stock from the mid-20th century, she said. The cotton watermark matches the hospital's documented supply for that period. The ink composition on all 3 certificates is chemically consistent with iron gall formulations used in medical records through the early 1950s. She paused, and the signature is the same person across all 3 certificates and the reference documents. Same pressure pattern, same characteristic break in the capital C, same slight, rightward lean that develops in the second half of each specimen. I would put it at 100%. Lillian nodded. There is something else, Helena said. She had located a microfilm archive of Windsor County Hospital records from 1948. The hospital had been methodical about its documentation in that period, keeping a separate delivery record that logged every birth by date and attending physician and patient name. Helena had found the entry for March 12, 1948. Patient E. Carraway, attending A. Crane, nurse on duty, V. Marsh, live birth male. The entry was 3 lines long and entirely routine in its language, the language of an institution recording a fact, and it matched the first birth certificate exactly. There were corresponding entries in 1950 and 1952. The hospital had written it down 3 times in a record that had been sitting on a microfilm reel in a university archive for decades, available to anyone who thought to look. Helena set down her pen and folded her hands on the desk. Mrs. Beckford, she said, these birth certificates are authentic. All 3 children were born to Edith Carraway. And based on what you have described regarding the sealed adoption records, I need to tell you something. For a legal adoption to have occurred, there must be a document by which the birth mother terminates her parental rights. That document would need to have been signed by Edith Carraway herself. If the adoption records are sealed, we cannot see whether that document exists. But if it does not exist, then the adoptions were not legally completed. And if they were not legally completed, then under Vermont statute, Edith Carraway remained the legal mother of all 3 children until her death. She took off her safety glasses and set them on the table. What that means for inheritance law and for the legal identities of the three individuals is a matter for an attorney, not for me. But the documents themselves are real. What happened to those children happened. And whoever did it used power and money and a sealed court record to make certain no one would ever be able to prove it. Until now. Lillian was quiet for a moment. Helena asked the question she had been working up to since the first morning. She asked it carefully, the way careful people ask the questions they actually mean. "What are you going to do with this?" Lillian looked at the 3 birth certificates laid out on the examination table, the cotton paper, the black ink, the red stamp of Dr. Amos Crane. She said, "I lost my daughter 20 years ago. She was 28 years old. I would give everything I have left for one more afternoon with her. These 3 people had their birth mother living less than a mile from them for 20 years, and they never knew. They passed her on the street, possibly. They may have looked at her from a distance the same way she looked at them. And no one told them. No one thought they had a right to know who they came from." She picked up the first certificate and looked at the name on the line marked Mother. "That is not protection," she said. "That is theft." She drove back to Corinth that evening and spent the night in the cottage on Elm Street. She slept in the small bedroom off the back hallway in a folding cot she had brought from Burlington, and she lay awake for a while listening to the house settle and thinking about what she was about to do. In the morning, she organized the forensic report. The hospital microfilm records the 3 original birth certificates, the photographs, and Edith's letter into a folder of the kind she used to bring to parent conferences, plain manila, her name, written on the tab in her usual hand. She put the folder in her bag and drove to the courthouse. The secretary met her in the front hall and said that the judge was expecting her. She was shown to a door at the end of a carpeted corridor, a door of heavy oak with a brass nameplate. She knocked once and went in. The room was exactly what a county judge's chambers looked like after 40 years of accumulation. Bookshelves on 3 walls, a desk large enough to seat a small committee, the smell of paper and wood oil and something that might have been pipe tobacco from a decade earlier. Malcolm Winthrop was 76 years old and sat behind the desk in a dark suit with the posture of a man who had spent decades being looked at by people who needed to believe he was certain about things. His face was long and sharp-featured and composed in the particular neutral expression of someone who made a practice of revealing nothing before they had decided what to reveal. He looked at Lillian the way he had probably looked at a great many people who came to his office with things they believed were important. "You indicated this concerns my mother," he said. "Eleanor Winthrop passed away in 1999. I am not certain what matter could remain outstanding after 25 years. Lillian set the folder on his desk. She did not open it yet. "Not Mrs. Winthrop," she said. "Your birth mother. Her name was Edith Carraway. She lived at the end of Elm Street. She died in February of 1955, alone in a house that had a fireplace that was not a fireplace, and she spent the last 20 years of her life sitting at her front window watching you walk to school." Malcolm Winthrop looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at the folder on his desk. Malcolm Winthrop did not reach for the folder immediately. He sat behind his desk and looked at it the way Lillian had seen people look at documents they already suspected contained something they could not unknow. She had seen that look in her classroom sometimes in students who had found something in a primary source that contradicted what they had always been told, the brief stillness before the mind begins its work. Then he opened it. She watched him read. She had taught herself over 34 years not to interpret the faces of people reading, to wait for the words rather than the expression. But she could not entirely help herself. She watched his eyes move down the first certificate and stop, move back to the top, read it again. He set it down and picked up the second, then the third, then the letter. He read the letter slowly in the way people read something when they are aware that the pace of their reading is the last small control they have over the moment. When he finished, he set it on the desk beside the certificates and looked at the photographs. 3 newborn faces on thin old paper. He picked up the first one and turned it over. "Thomas, 3 days old. Be strong." He set it down very carefully. The room was quiet for a long time. Outside, through the heavy window glass, Lillian could hear the courthouse traffic, a door somewhere down the corridor, the ordinary sounds of a building full of people going about the normal business of a Wednesday morning. Then Malcolm said in a voice that was nearly his regular voice, but not entirely, "My name is not Malcolm Winthrop." It came out less as a question than as a man trying a sentence for the first time to see if it held together. Lillian said, "Your birth name was Thomas. Your mother chose that name. She wrote it on the back of your photograph 3 days after you were born, and she sealed it in a brass box behind a false fireplace, and she kept it there for the rest of her life." He looked at her. She waited. He said she lived at the end of Elm Street. "Yes. I know that house. I have driven past that house." She knew. He was quiet again. Then he said, "How long did she live there?" "From at least the early 1940s, Lillian said. "She died in February of 1955. The obituary said she had no children." He pressed his hands flat on the desk. A deliberate gesture, she thought, the gesture of a man accustoming himself to a surface. She watched him make the call to Eleanor Pemberton himself, standing at his office window with his back to Lillian, speaking in a voice too low for her to make out the words. Then a second call to a number in Boston. Both calls were short. She heard him say the name Edith Carraway once to each of them. 2 days later, they came to Corinth. Lillian had offered to leave them to it. Malcolm had asked her to stay. He said it in the way people ask for things they are not certain they are entitled to ask for, carefully and without elaboration. She stayed. They met in the front room of the cottage on Elm Street, which Lillian had cleaned in the days between, but left otherwise as she had found it: the wingback chair, the empty bookshelf, the 2 fireplaces. She had set the brass box and its contents on the low table in the center of the room. Eleanor Pemberton was 74 years old and had driven up from Montpelier with her youngest daughter, who waited in the car at Lillian's gentle suggestion. She was a small woman with white hair and the worn, capable hands of someone who had spent decades in practical work, and she came into the room and looked around it with the careful attention of a person trying to place herself in a story she had just been handed the middle of. Samuel Cross had flown in from Boston that morning. He was 72, lean and deliberate in his movements, with the particular stillness of a man who had spent a career in operating rooms where stillness was a form of precision. He looked at everything in the room once quickly and completely, and then sat down and did not move. The 3 of them sat around the table where the box sat open. Lillian sat near the window, slightly apart. It was Ellie who reached for the blanket. She lifted it from the box with both hands and held it in her lap, the knitting needles still threaded through the last unfinished row of stitches. "She was making this," Ellie said. Her voice was steady but soft. "She was making this for one of us." Nobody answered. There was nothing to add to it. Samuel picked up the letter and read it. He had already read it, Lillian knew, from the copies she had sent ahead. But he read it again in the room where it had been written, and she watched him read the same passage twice that Malcolm had read, twice the passage about the window and the bicycle and the corner of Elm Street. Then he set it down and looked at the window. "She watched us ride bicycles past this corner," he said. "I remember that corner. I rode past it every day on the way to school." He paused. "I never looked at this house." The room was quiet after that for a while. Malcolm was sitting with his hands folded on his knees and his eyes on the floor between his feet. He was a man who had spent 4 decades presiding over other people's truths, deciding what the record would say and what weight it would carry. He looked for the first time in the 2 days Lillian had known him like someone who was not certain what the record should say. He said quietly, to no one in particular, "My parents, Eleanor and Charles Winthrop. They kept this from me for 76 years. Ellie said they raised you. That is not the same thing." "No," she said, "it is not. But there is a difference between a lie and a silence." Samuel said from the window, "What is the difference?" "Raising a child without telling them the truth of where they came from. That is a particular kind of silence. It has a shape." Nobody argued with that. The room held the weight of it without anyone trying to move it. After a long time, Malcolm stood up. He walked to the window, the same window, and stood in the same place that Lillian had stood when she first read the letter and understood what it meant that the view from that window was what it was. He looked out at Elm Street. The maples were nearly bare now. A few leaves came down in the still air and settled on the road and stayed there. He said, "I am going to petition to unseal the adoption records, all 3 of them." He said it in his judicial voice, the voice he used when he had arrived at a decision. "I am going to ask the county court to recognize our birth names on the record: Thomas, Margaret, John." He paused. "And I want her grave to have a new stone. Not Harold Carraway's daughter." He said that name with a flatness that was its own judgment. "I want it to say what is true. Mother of Thomas, Margaret, and John." Ellie was crying quietly, the way people cry when something they have felt their whole lives without being able to name it finally gets a name. Samuel did not cry. He stood at the window looking out at the empty street, and whatever he was feeling he kept in the way he had kept things his whole life, somewhere interior and precise, and probably very large. Lillian sat near the window and did not say anything because there was nothing that needed saying. The house was quiet around them. The afternoon light came through the dusty glass and lay across the floor in long, pale bars, the same light that had come through that window every afternoon for 100 years, the same light Edith Carraway had sat in, watching the street, watching the years, watching 3 children who did not know she was there. Now they were here, in her house, sitting with her things, saying her name. If you have been watching this story, leave a comment. If you found out at 76 years old that your whole life had been built on a name that was not yours, and that the woman who gave you your real name had spent 20 years watching you from a window at the end of your street, would you want to know? Or would you rather the box had stayed sealed? Tell us below. Because in the next part, the county courthouse opens a record that has been locked for 70 years, and what it contains will determine whether Edith Carraway is finally allowed to be in the official memory of this town what she always was. The petition was 3 pages long, and Malcolm had written it himself, which was unusual, the kind of thing a judge's clerk would normally handle. He told Lillian this when he called to let her know it had been filed. She understood without him saying it directly that writing it himself had been important to him, that there were things you needed to do with your own hand. The presiding judge came from Chittenden County, brought in to hear the matter because Malcolm had recused himself from everything connected to it, which meant recusing himself from his own case, which was the kind of procedural strangeness that made the county clerk's office very quiet for several days while everyone decided how to process it. The hearing took 40 minutes. The sealed adoption files from 1948, 1950, and 1952 were opened in the presence of counsel, and the record was read into the court transcript. What the files contained confirmed what Edith's letter had said, and what Helena Vance's forensic report had demonstrated, and what Lillian had understood from the moment she read the will of Harold Carraway, and found the word forbearance sitting in it like a stone. Harold Carraway had signed all 3 transfer documents himself in his capacity as Justice of the Peace. His signature appeared in the space designated for the presiding judicial officer. In the space designated for the birth mother's consent on all 3 documents, there was no signature. There was a line. The line was blank. Edith Carraway had never signed anything. The judge from Chittenden County read this into the record in the same flat judicial tone used for all findings of fact, and did not editorialize, which was correct, and which Lillian respected, though she thought that a finding of fact did not always convey what the fact actually meant. What it meant was that Harold Carraway had taken 3 children from their mother, using the authority of his judicial office, and had not bothered to obtain her consent because he had not needed to, because she had no recourse, because in 1948 in Windsor County, Vermont, a justice of the peace who owned the mill and sat on the county board and gave money to the church, did not need his unmarried daughter's signature to do what he had decided to do. The Corinth Town Council met on a Thursday evening 3 weeks later. The meeting room was in the old town hall on Main Street, a room with wide plank floors and a ceiling that had been painted once and not since, and the kind of wooden chairs that had been in that room since before anyone present had been born. It was full. Lillian had not expected it to be as full as it was people standing along the walls, a number of them, the age that meant their parents or grandparents had been in Corinth in 1955, and had read the 4-sentence obituary in the Corinth Courier, and had known what it said, and had known what it did not say. Malcolm spoke first. He stood at the front of the room in a dark suit without his judicial robes, which she thought was a deliberate choice, and he spoke without notes, which she was certain was a deliberate choice. He said, "My birth name is Thomas. My mother was Edith Carraway, who lived at the end of Elm Street and died in this town in 1955. The official record of this town says she had no children. I am standing here as evidence that the official record is wrong." He said, "I will keep the name Winthrop. The family that raised me well, and whatever was taken from my mother was not taken by me, and I do not intend to erase what was real in my own life in the process of correcting what was wrong in hers. But I will also carry her name. From today on, every court document and every official record, my name is Malcolm Thomas Winthrop Carraway." Ellie was sitting in the front row, and when Malcolm finished, she stood up without being asked and said, "Margaret. My mother called me Margaret. I am Eleanor Margaret Pemberton Carraway." Samuel stood up from the other end of the row. He said it quietly, the way he said most things. "John. She called me John. Samuel John Cross Carraway." The room was silent for a moment, not the silence of discomfort, but the silence of people absorbing something. Then the council voted. The Carraway cottage at the end of Elm Street would be entered into the Corinth Historic Register. Its official name from that point forward would be Edith Carraway Cottage. A bronze plaque would be mounted by the front door. Lillian had been asked to help draft the text of the plaque, and had spent 2 evenings on it, which was longer than it had taken to write some things she had spent weeks on, because the plaque needed to be honest without being prosecutorial, and needed to say in a few lines what had taken 70 years to unseal. The final text read, "Here Edith Carraway, 1903 to 1955, lived and loved her 3 children from a distance. The official record of this town once stated she died without children. The truth is that she was the mother of Thomas Margaret and John." The plaque for the grave was simpler. The old stone had said, "Edith Carraway, beloved daughter of Harold Carraway." Lillian had not been present when the old stone was removed, and she was glad she had not been, though she understood it had been done respectfully, and that Malcolm had been there. The new stone said, "Edith Carraway, 1903 to 1955, mother of Thomas Margaret and John." 7 words in the second line. Edith had waited 70 years for 7 words. It was a clear afternoon in November when they gathered at the cemetery, the 3 of them and Lillian and a few others who had found their way into the story over the preceding weeks. The maples were bare by then, the hills around Corinth gone to the gray and brown of late autumn, and the light was the low, flat light of November that makes everything look both very old and very clear. Ellie had brought white flowers, simple ones, and she and Samuel and Malcolm stood at the new stone for a while without speaking. Then each of them set a flower at the base and stepped back. Lillian stood at the edge of the path a little apart, the way she had sat a little apart in the house when the 3 of them were together, understanding that there was a circle here she was adjacent to rather than inside. She heard Ellie's footsteps on the gravel path behind her. "Mrs. Beckford." Lillian turned. Ellie stood with her hands at her sides, her face open in the way faces get when people have cried recently and the crying has cleared something. She said, "Why did you do this? You did not know her. You are not related to any of us. You bought a house at a tax auction. Why?" Lillian looked at the new stone, at the 7 words in the second line. She said, "I lost my daughter 20 years ago. She was 28. I think about her every day the way you think about someone when the thinking is not a choice. When it just happens when you reach for something in a cupboard, and she is there, when you drive past a place she liked, and she is there. She is always there, and she is also not there, and you learn to live with both of those things being true at the same time." She paused. Edith Carraway spent 20 years watching her children live their lives from a window at the end of a street. She never stopped being their mother. And when she died, this town wrote 4 sentences about her and said she had no children, and that was the last word, and it would have stayed the last word. She looked at Ellie. "I know what it is to lose a child, and I could not let the last word be a lie. 6 months is enough time for a house to become something else entirely. If the person working on it understands what they are preserving and what they are restoring and knows the difference between the two. Lillian had spent the first month on the structural work, the roof and the foundation sills and the window frames that had gone soft with decades of weather. She hired a contractor from the next town over a quiet man named Gerald, who asked few questions and did careful work, and who, when she explained that the north fireplace was to remain exactly as it was open and exposed to the room, with the removed stones stacked neatly beside it, looked at it for a moment and said all right and did not ask why. The second month she spent on the interior. She did not try to make it new. She stripped the paint that had gone gray and put back a color close to what the original would have been, a warm off-white that the light in the afternoon turned almost cream. She refinished the floors but left the wear patterns where they were, the path from the door to the window, the hollow in front of the north fireplace, where someone had stood many times over many years. She cleaned the windows, but left the slight wavy distortion of the old glass. She wanted it to look like a house that had been cared for, not a house that had been erased. By the time she brought the proposal to the town council in April, she had already spoken with Malcolm and Ellie and Samuel, and all three of them had said yes before she had finished explaining. Malcolm had said it in the way he said things he had already decided. Ellie had said it while she was still crying a little. Samuel had said it by asking a single practical question about the display case dimensions and then nodding once when she answered. The council approved it on the second vote. The first vote had been unanimous, but the council chairman had asked for a second vote to be certain everyone understood that this was now a permanent matter of public record, that the town of Corinth was formally adopting the corrected history as its own. The second vote was also unanimous. The display case was built by a cabinet maker in Montpellier, glass-fronted, climate-controlled set into the east wall of the front room at a height that allowed the objects inside to be seen clearly without bending. The brass box sat open at the center, around it arranged on a piece of faded green cloth that Lillian had chosen because it was close to the color of the patina, were the 3 birth certificates, the 3 photographs face up, and then turned to show the handwriting on the back, the unfinished blanket with the knitting needles still in it, and Edith's letter open to the page behind a sheet of preservation glass. The false fireplace remained open beside it. The removed stones were stacked to one side, mortar still visible on their edges, exactly as they had been when Lillian first pulled them free on a Monday morning in October, with a pry bar and a flashlight and no idea what she was looking for. She had written the interpretive card herself. In the autumn of 1954, Edith Carraway sealed this box behind the back wall of a fireplace that was never meant to hold fire. She was 51 years old and she knew she was dying. She had spent the previous 20 years watching her 3 children grow up from the window of this room. She had never been allowed to cross the street and speak to them. She sealed the box and left it, and trusted that someone would eventually find it. It took 70 years. The morning of the opening was clear and cold. The first week of May, the lilacs along the fence line in full bloom for the first time in anyone's memory of the property, or perhaps simply noticed for the first time. Lillian stood at the front door in her gray coat and watched people come up the walk in 1s and 2s, people she recognized from the council meetings and people she did not recognize, younger people and older people, and a number of people who stood for a long time in front of the display case without saying anything. Malcolm arrived with a woman Lillian understood to be his daughter, who stood beside her father in front of the open fireplace and looked at the stones for a long time. He was wearing a dark suit, and his name tag, prepared by the council's administrative office, read Malcolm Thomas Winthrop Carraway. He had asked that it read that way. Lillian had made sure it did. Ellie came with 2 of her grandchildren, a boy of about 12 and a girl a few years younger, and she knelt beside the girl in front of the display case and pointed at the unfinished blanket and said something Lillian was too far away to hear, and the girl nodded slowly in the way children nod when they are trying to understand something very large. Samuel stood alone in front of the display case for several minutes, then moved to the window and stood there looking out at Elm Street, in the same place he had stood on the afternoon he first came to the house, and said, "I never looked at this house." And Lillian thought he was probably thinking about that, about all the mornings he had ridden his bicycle past this window, and the woman inside it had watched him go. A reporter from the county paper found Lillian near the end of the morning and asked her a handful of questions, the usual questions, dates and names and the sequence of events, and then asked the one that was not the usual question. "You paid $14,000 for this house at a tax auction," he said. "Now it is a museum. Do you have any regrets?" Lillian looked at the front of the house, at the bronze plaque by the door, at the name above it on the new sign the council had installed the previous week. She said, "I did not buy a house. I found a mother." The reporter wrote it down. By late afternoon, the visitors had gone, and the volunteer docent the Historical Society had assigned for opening day had locked the display case and gone home, and the house was quiet again, the way it had always been quiet, the particular quiet of a house that has held a great deal and is accustomed to holding it. Lillian sat in the wingback chair by the north fireplace. The chair had been reupholstered in a fabric close to the original, a muted green that Ellie had helped her choose from a sample book, and it sat where it had always sat, angled toward the window and the open fireplace both. She picked up the blanket from where she had set it on the side table, the display case being locked for the night and this being the last evening she would have it to herself before it became a permanent part of the exhibit. The wool was very soft, despite its age, white gone ivory, the stitches small and even, and then in the last 2 inches, slightly less, even the tension changing, in a way that might mean hurry, or might mean cold hands, or might mean something else entirely. The knitting needles were still in the last row of stitches. She held it in her lap and looked at the open fireplace, at the dark hollow where the box had sat for 70 years, and at the window and at the evening light, coming through the old glass and laying itself across the floor. She said quietly to the room, to the window, to whoever was or was not there, "You never heard them call you mother, not once, not out loud, not in a way you could hold on to. And the town wrote 4 sentences about you and said you had no children, and that was supposed to be the last word." She looked at the plaque visible through the window, the one by the front door, the one that said what it said. But now they know she said, all of them. The whole town knows you were their mother. She sat there until the light was gone and the room was dark and quiet around her, the blanket in her hands, the open fireplace beside her, the window in front of her, and somewhere across town in the November dark, in a cemetery on a low hill above the river, a stone that said what had always been true and had taken 70 years to be allowed to say it out loud. If this story stayed with you, please like this video. Lillian Beckford paid $14,000 for a house at a county tax auction and found inside it a mother who had been waiting 70 years to be found. If you believe every mother deserves to be remembered by name, by the people she loved, by the town she never left, this is the one small thing you can do for Edith Carraway today. A year is enough time for a town to decide what it wants to remember. The 98th Corinth Harvest Festival opened on the second Saturday of October under a sky that was the particular hard blue of New England autumn, the kind of blue that only appears after the first cold nights have cleared everything soft out of the air. The maples on the green were at full color, red and orange, and the deep gold that only lasts a few days before it goes, and the bunting on the booths was the same red and white it had been for nearly a century, and the smell of cider and wood smoke moved through the crowd the way it always did. And to anyone who had been coming to this festival for decades, it would have looked at first like every other year. But at the north end of the green, where the Historical Society usually set up a table with old photographs and a donation jar, there was something different this year. The booth was larger than usual, framed in simple white-painted wood, with a roof against the weather, and along the back wall ran a banner that read in letters large enough to read from across the green, "The Women Corinth Forgot." Below it, a row of framed photographs. Some were formal portraits, the kind taken for church directories and school records. Some were candid, caught at the edges of other photographs the way women of that era often were present, but peripheral, standing just outside the frame of the official story. At the center of the row, the largest frame held a photograph that Lillian had last seen in a folder in the Windsor County Historical Society archive, a 4x6 print slightly overexposed taken at this festival in the autumn of 1953. Edith Carraway stood at the right edge of the image in her gray coat, holding her handbag with both hands not looking at the camera. She was looking toward the center of the photograph, toward the carousel, toward 3 children she was not permitted to approach. Below the photograph, a card in the same format as the interpretive card in the cottage, the same typeface, the same measured language. Edith Carraway, 1903 to 1955. She stood at the edge of this festival for 20 years and watched her 3 children grow up from a distance of 20 feet. The official record of this town once stated she died without children. The truth recovered in 2025 from a brass box sealed behind a false fireplace on Elm Street is that she was the mother of Thomas, Margaret, and John. Their names are now on her grave. Her name is now on the map. Lillian arrived at the booth before it opened and stood looking at the photograph for a while before the crowds came. She had seen it many times by now, had held the original in her hands in the archive, and in the examination room in Burlington, and in the front room of the cottage on more than one occasion when she had taken it out to show a visitor. She knew the image well enough that she could have described every element of it from memory. But seeing it here full size at the center of a wall of women's faces, at a festival Edith had attended every year until she was too ill to come, at the edge of the green, where Edith had stood in her gray coat and watched and not spoken, something in the proportion of it was different. The photograph had the same content it had always had, but its meaning had changed the way the meaning of a word changes when you finally understand the sentence it belongs to. Malcolm arrived with his daughter and 2 grandchildren he had not brought to anything public before, and Lillian understood without being told that this was a deliberate choice, that he was bringing them here specifically, that he was beginning the work of telling them something. He stood in front of his mother's photograph for a long time. He did not say anything to Lillian, and she did not say anything to him. There was an understanding between them by now that had developed over the preceding year, not a close friendship exactly, but something that had no clean name, the understanding between 2 people who have stood together at the edge of a large truth, and neither of them has looked away. Ellie came with her daughter and 3 of the grandchildren, the 12-year-old boy, and the girl from the museum opening, and a younger one who had not been old enough at the time to understand what was happening, but was old enough now to look at the photograph and ask in a clear child's voice that carried across the booth, "Is that her? Is that who she looked like?" And Ellie said yes, that is what she looked like. Samuel came alone as he usually did, but he had driven up from Boston the previous evening and spent the night at the inn on Main Street, rather than making the trip a day trip, which Lillian had noticed meant something, though she was not certain exactly what. He stood in front of the photograph for a shorter time than the others, but with the same quality of attention, the attention of a man who had spent his career looking at things very carefully and knowing what he was looking for. Then he turned and found Lillian and said without preamble, "I think she would have liked this." Lillian considered it. She said, "I think she would have found it strange." A photograph of herself at the festival she attended in secret for 20 years now displayed at the festival. She would have found the irony a little heavy. Samuel looked at her for a moment. Then he said yes, but I think she would have liked it anyway. In the early afternoon, the mayor of Corinth stood at the small podium the council had set up beside the booth and read a brief statement into a microphone that crackled once and then settled. The statement acknowledged formally that the town's historical record had for 70 years contained an error regarding Edith Carraway. The error was not accidental. It had been produced deliberately by people in positions of authority who had used that authority to erase a woman's identity as a mother, and the town of Corinth formally acknowledged that this had been done, that it had been wrong, and that the corrected record was now the official record. He did not use the word apology. Lillian had been part of the conversation about the statement's language, and had thought carefully about that word, and had concluded that an apology from a living institution for an act committed by dead individuals was a particular kind of language that meant different things to different people, and that what the moment required was not the performance of contrition, but the simple act of stating the truth plainly, in public, in a place where it could be heard and recorded and could not be unsaid. The mayor read the statement plainly and without drama, and when he finished there was a moment of quiet from the crowd around the booth, and then ordinary sound returned, the voices and the music and the smell of cider, and the festival continued. In the late afternoon, when the light had gone low and gold, and the shadows of the maples were long across the green, Lillian walked to the corner of Elm Street and stood at the entrance to the road. From here she could see the festival green behind her, and the cottage ahead, its new paint and clean windows visible at the far end of the street, the bronze plaque by the door catching the last of the light. She thought about a woman who had stood at that window looking out at this corner for 20 years. She thought about what it cost to stay, to choose proximity over contact presence, over acknowledgement, the difficult daily decision to remain within sight of what you loved when you were not permitted to touch it. She had taught her students to ask what an act of historical injustice cost the person it was committed against. Not abstractly, not in terms of legal or material harm, but in the specific daily currency of a human life. What did it cost Edith Carraway every morning to look out that window? What did it cost her to come to this festival every year and stand at the edge of the crowd and watch? What did it cost her to knit a blanket for a child she was not allowed to keep and set it in a box and seal the box with lead and trust it to the future? The answer was everything. It cost everything every day for 20 years. And then it cost 70 more years of silence of a 4-sentence obituary and a headstone that said the wrong thing and the town that knew better saying nothing and the children she had watched from the window growing old without knowing who had watched them. Lillian stood at the corner for a while longer. The festival music drifted down Elm Street and mixed with the sound of the wind in the bare-limbed trees, and the last of the maple leaves came down one or two at a time and settled on the road. Then she walked up Elm Street toward the cottage, toward the bronze plaque, and the clean windows and the open fireplace inside, where the box had waited in the dark for 70 years. And she thought that if a town could change what it chose to remember, and if a grave could say a true thing after saying a false thing for 7 decades, and if 3 people could spend the last years of their lives knowing who their mother was, and being known as her children, then perhaps the cost of the thing that had been done was not the final word. Perhaps the final word was this: a name on a grave, a photograph at a festival, a brass box under glass in the room where a woman had sat by her window every day and loved what she was not permitted to hold. Her name is now on the map. That was the final word.